Hello, welcome again to the Daily Mishnayot. Today we'll be learning Brachot, the 6th parak, the 5th and 6th Mishnayot. Our learning should be in memory of Lenny Spodek, Liu Nishma, Yehuda Ben Yisrael. And let's get right into the Mishnah. So this Mishnah is going to discuss the certain requirements that one has to make the blessing on wine during a meal. So there's certain sections of a meal that there's 3 sections that we should mention. So there's a category of before the meal, before we actually satisfy our hunger and eat the main component of the meal. There's the middle part of the meal, which is actually we're eating to satisfy our hunger. And then there's after the meal, which is, for example, we're eating dessert or something like that, just for its taste, not actually to satisfy our hunger. And so these are 3 categories of food. We should also note that the blessing, that the hamotzi blessing, which is the blessing on bread, suffices for the meal itself. However, it doesn't cover the blessing of wine, which is Borei Pri Hagafen, because of wine's significance. So that's what we should know. So we should also note that even more commonly, many times. Many years ago, wine would be drunk many times during the meal, or before the meal or after the meal. It might be drunk. There might be a glass of wine drunk before the meal, just just as a taste before the meal, and then it might be drunk during the meal as a drink just to have during the meal to help the food go down, and it might be drunk after the meal as a kind of dessert type of wine just to have after the meal. So the Mishnah is discussing at certain times when one makes the blessing of Borei Pri Hagafen, this blessing on wine, if it suffices for multiple categories or multiple sections of the meal or not, or it's considered separate. So let's just get into the Mishnah. So, if one makes a blessing on the on wine, which is before one makes the blessing on bread, so you fulfill your requirement of you fill the requirement of making another blessing if you drink wine again after the meal. So this is speaking about a case where one makes a blessing of and drinks wine before the meal, and then there's an interruption. One eats the meal and then has a glass of wine after. So do we say this is considered an interruption, or do we say it's one long continuation of the meal? So the Mishnah rules here that if one drinks wine before the meal, it's considered like one long meal, and one would not have to recite another blessing on the wine if he drinks it after the meal again. So let us continue in the Mishnah, and it should also be noted that this occurs like on the Sabbath and festivals when wine is commonly drunk, because one usually has the intent that he's going to drink a lot because one's in a joyous mood during these times, during the Sabbath and the festivals and certain holidays. And he has in mind that he's going to drink after. However, on other days, sometimes one wouldn't have in mind. However, nevertheless, if one does have in mind that he wants to fulfill his obligation on wine that he will drink after the meal, and he's going to make this blessing before the meal, then that is also valid. So, additionally, if one were to say a blessing over parperet, what is parperet? Parperet is a certain type of dish, which, for example, there's different differences of opinions. So it's according to one opinion, it's actually like certain foods that are commonly eaten with bread. So, for example, like meat, a lot of the time will be eaten together with bread, and like eggs also a lot of the time are eaten together with bread, and this is actually part of the meal itself, and it's covered with the blessing on the bread, because the bread is the main component of sustenance. As we know that the primary meal, at least many years ago, was bread. That was the main component of most most meals. And these other secondary foods that are eaten with bread or together with bread are considered secondary and are covered by the blessing of the bread, because we know that primary blessing, blessing on something that is primary covers something that is secondary. And alternatively, parperes is a dish that is composed of bread. It's like maybe a certain type of like croutons that can maybe eat together with they could be eaten as like an appetizer or during the meal, and additionally after the meal, just as like for like taste. So it could be eaten at certain parts during the meal. And so we're saying that if one makes a blessing on bread, so if one makes a blessing on this parperet, which is this type of food that's normally eaten together with bread. So for example, it doesn't always have to be eaten with bread. So for example, if one eats meat without bread or eats eggs without bread, and he makes a blessing on this specifically, and he eats this before the bread, so if one eats this food, this meat or eggs or whatever this food is after the bread, also he has to make another blessing because it's considered one long meal. One isn't required to make separate blessings. However, we as I mentioned previously, if one makes a blessing on bread, he satisfies the obligation to make a blessing on this parperet, this meat or eggs, or this crouton type of food, because this is a secondary food. It's also eaten for sustenance, but bread is the main component of sustenance, so it's satisfied. This parperet, ala parperet lo fadar tapa. But if one makes the blessing the opposite way, if one makes a blessing on the parperet, which is the meat or the eggs or these croutons, then this would not satisfy the obligation to make the obligation of making a blessing on bread. And this is because this would not satisfy the obligation because the parperet, which is the croutons or the meat or the eggs, is a secondary food to bread, and it wouldn't satisfy the bread's obligation. Additionally, this might have been seen as obvious, so the Gemara actually says that one might say that because the blessing on parperet, which is like in the case of meat or eggs, is a shehakol blessing, one might think shehakol that covers everything, as we mentioned previously. However, here we say that no, shehakol doesn't cover the bread because one's main intent wasn't on the bread, which is one answer. The bread also has special significance because when one makes a shehakol blessing, he's covering the parperet specifically, this meat or eggs, and not having intent for the bread. So that is also an additional reasoning why the Mishnah mentions this. Beit Shammai Omrim, so a dissenting of view is that the school of Shammai states that aflo ma'aseh kedera. So even if one makes a blessing on parperet, this meat or eggs, he hasn't satisfied his obligation for like a cereal type of food, like an oatmeal type of food, like porridge. So this doesn't satisfy his obligation here. And this is because porridge, which is like a cereal type of food, requires the mizono blessing, and that's a blessing higher significance than the parperet, which is shehakol. One might think that shehakol should cover everything. However, in this case, because mizono is a higher type of blessing, it's more important, more significant. This blessing on parperet would not cover the blessing on porridge. And that is the end of the first Mishnah. Let's continue on to the second Mishnah of the day, the sixth Mishnah of the parak. So, we should understand first, before starting the Mishnah, that there's a concept called Shomea Ki'oneh, that one who hears and answers Amen to the end of a blessing is as if he said the blessing himself. So it's actually preferable that one say Amen at the end of the blessing, that who just listens to someone else say the blessing, because it's more praiseworthy for one to praise God with a multitude of people and together, as opposed to by themselves and separately. So that is the concept we're going to discuss. Additionally, however, this could only be used in a situation where people are eating together. And in a situation where people are just eating separately, like their own separate kind of meals or their own separate eatings and separate like situations that they're in, this cannot be done. So the Mishnah is actually going to discuss, at least for the beginning of it, how what is considered these people eating together, and then in what situations may they recite the blessings as one and as a unit. Okay, so let's start the Mishnah. Hayu yoshvin le'echol. So if people are sitting to eat, kol echad ve'echad mevarach le'atzmo. So this is talking about a situation where people are just either just sitting down to eat, or they're like scattered around the table. Not specifically, they're not kovei asuda, as we would call it. They're not establishing a specific meal here. So each one would make the blessing by himself, because as we will see later in the Mishnah, only one reclining, which is the ways in the Mishnaic times, which is how one would actually eat a meal. How would they eat a meal? They would recline, and then that would be considered as if they're establishing their meal and eating it there. However, other interpretations understand this as meaning that people are just scattered all over the table. They're just sitting down. They're yoshin lechol. They're just sitting to eat. They're not specifically establishing a meal. They just happen to be sitting at the same table, and in this sense, they're not as one unit. So in this case, each one would make the blessing by himself, because according to either interpretation, they're not considered one unit, because either they're scattered or they're not reclining, and therefore each one must recite his own blessings to himself, and cannot fulfill his blessings by the recitation of another. Hey Sebu, so if they all recline, or according to the other interpretation, if they all hesibu surround the table, meaning lesavev is a Hebrew word to surround, just shows the beauty of Torah, how many interpretations it could really have for one word and just one Mishnah. It's just the beauty, and you should understand this. And so let's get back to the Mishnah. So if people are surrounding a table specifically to eat, and with the purpose of eating, then echad mevarach l'chol. One is can make the blessing for all of them and fulfill all their obligations of their blessings. And this is allowed to be done because they are either reclining, which is they're sitting down to establish a meal, or they are surrounding a table and with the intent to have a meal together. So if wine is brought to them during the meal, we know that wine, even though one makes a blessing on bread, which is primary and should fulfill all other foods during the meal, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of wine, because wine has special significance. One must make an additional blessing on wine. So the Mishnah states that even if people are joined together to form a meal, if wine is brought during the meal, one cannot make a blessing for everyone for this wine. Why not? Because the Gemara suggests that while one is eating, he may not have the proper concentration on the blessing of someone else who's making the blessing. If he's eating, right? Someone else is making a blessing for you. You're eating. You might not have the proper concentration that's required to make this blessing on the wine. So that's why one should not have one fulfill everyone else. Additionally, the Gemara suggests that if one must answer amen at the end of a blessing, in order to, in the best way possible, at least in order to fulfill his obligation to eat this certain item or fulfill his obligation of the blessing. However, if one is in the middle of eating, we're concerned that someone might choke as he's reciting the words of Amen, and we don't want it to happen, God forbid. So we say that each one should make the blessing to himself while he's done with his food and he has the proper concentration to make the blessing. However, if wine is brought to a feast after the meal, the main part of the meal, the sustenance component of the meal, then one is allowed to make the blessing for everyone. Why? Because at this point, one's not eating as much as he usually would. Maybe he's just eating dessert, but he's not eating his complete meal, and he would be able to have a certain higher degree of concentration. And also, he wouldn't. We're not concerned for choking because he's not eating at the same degree as he's eating during the meal. V'hu omer al mugmar. So. And also now we're going to discuss a separate category. In Mishnaic times, additionally, after a meal, one would burn certain types of incense and certain types of good smelling fragrances just to have like a good smell after the meal. I mean, it seems like a very, very nice idea. V'hu omer ala mogmar, and the one who makes the blessing for who fulfills everyone's obligation for the blessing of Birkat Hamazon. This is the blessing that we previously discussed many chapters ago. The blessing that one makes after eating bread. The one who makes the blessing for everyone on the bread, he makes also this blessing that you would say before incense. This is actually a different category of blessings, not specifically on food, but we also make a blessing praising God for the certain types of fragrances He created in this world. So before smelling certain fragrances, we also make a blessing. So who makes this blessing for everyone? The one who makes the blessing on Birkat Hamazon, the one who makes the blessing on the bread. We allow this person who makes the blessing on the bread to make the blessing on the incense, even though the incense is done long after the blessing on the bread is made. And even though there is like a break in between, we still give the person the honor of making the blessing on the incense because he made the blessing on the bread. So this is the end of the 6th mission on Brachot, the 2nd mission of the day. Thank you all for learning today. Learning should be in memory of Lenny Spodek, Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.